Welcome to Chapter 52. This is going to be kind of our, well, as the title says, Intro to Ecology. So we're going to talk about some of the basic principles of ecology just to get you guys started on your break work. So for starters, this apparently is the symbol for ecology, which I did not know, but it looks interesting enough. And this is people planting something. I don't know exactly why that needs to be perfect for this, but we will be talking about how different things interrelate with each other because that's really the idea of ecology. It's looking at how the different organisms interact. So within ecology, you're going to have the biotic, which is going to be all of the living stuff. And so this is how predators, prey, parasites, mutualistic things, all these organisms interact with one another. But then there's also going to be the abiotic stuff, the non-living factors, the environment that'll also be interacting with all of this living stuff. And so you'll see that the amount of sunlight, the amount of rainfall, the temperature, these abiotic conditions will affect what can live there. And in some cases too, the biotic components can kind of shift around stuff like soil. They can ultimately, in some cases, create microclimates by like creating burrows and such so they can hide away in them, create shade. So there will be some interplay between the biotic stuff and the abiotic stuff and vice versa. So that's really the heart of ecology. And then these are just some of the books that you've seen that really brought ecology more into the mainstream. Starting off, decades back, you had Silent Spring. So this was a big book that really came out and started to give kind of a push towards this idea of ecology and the role of just everyday people and our decisions in how we impact the environment. And then Ishmael's more of a recent book, obviously, that many of you guys have likely read within your English classes, that still takes a look at this issue, but a bit further on. I believe this one was in like the 90s versus Silent Spring, I want to say, was like the 60s. I could be off by a lot here. But they're kind of two different eras as we moved along. So Ishmael still's following that same idea of kind of humans' role in this ecology and how we alter the environment abiotically as well as biotically. So our personal impact in this. Now, when we look at ecology, there's kind of this hierarchy, and we've talked about some of the hierarchy before. We've talked about, atoms make up molecules. Molecules can make up organic molecules. Those organic molecules can come together to form cells. Cells ultimately can come together to form organisms if they're multicellular. But then above that, organisms together in a group that can interbreed will be a population. And then a population or group of populations in the same place, same time, all living though, that's community. And if you add in the abiotic stuff, so a community plus the abiotic will be an ecosystem. And then if you have an ecosystem and you kind of lump similar ecosystems together, you get biomes. And then if you lump all the biomes, the entire area on Earth that holds life, that's our biosphere. And so you can see off to the side, it just kind of goes through one lion's an organism, a pride's a population. The lions plus the other organisms, in this case they put zebras, but this would also include ants, elephants, all the stuff that's there. That would be the community. And then you'll see it includes the environment, so you're talking about sunlight, water, dirt, all that stuff makes it an ecosystem. And then the biosphere is just that strip several miles down, several miles up, all the way around the globe where life ultimately exists. All right. So biomes, I'm not going to make you guys memorize specific biomes, although you should have some general ideas that things that are like tropical rainforest, it's going to be wet and warm. Whenever I say tropical, just assume that means pretty much warm. Whenever you see forest, just keep in mind that the forest will always be where it's wetter. As you get drier, you're going to start to see grasslands, which could be savanna or chaparral. There's different names for stuff, but essentially grassland. And if you get dry enough, you get to where you'll have a desert or a tundra. And so we've got kind of low amounts of precipitation, and that's what this is basically on the bottom here. You'll see it's temp. On the side here, you'll see it's precipitation, or water in general. And so you'll just see that I want to make sure you get these ideas that the warmer it is, the more stuff you'll expect to see as far as species and organisms because it's more hospitable. You typically get more plant growth and autotroph growth when it's warmer. So tropical stuff will tend to be a bit more involved, but there's also a huge push by the amount of water. Water is a very limiting factor. And so if you have a relatively small amount, but not, well, if you have a really small amount, deserts or tundra, pretty much very little stuff. Not going to expect a lot of diversity or wildlife. As you start to go up where you get more moist, and ultimately a bit more warm, you start to get into forests, and then you get more diversity there. And then eventually you can get into these like tropical forests, or even your temperate rainforests, as they sometimes call them. They say wet forests here. But your rainforests, which have a lot of diversity, more so in the tropical, just because, once again, these tend to have a larger growing season. There's more plant life. Organisms survive better. Whereas in the temperate forests, you still typically have winter, so you still technically have things hibernate, or insects might die off for the winter temporarily, or burrow, or whatever else. So you just get less stuff during that period where it's cold. And so this lists some of the factors. So we've got temperature, precipitation, the amount of sunlight. So that one can be key when we're talking about temperate stuff. That tends to have ones that have these short sunlight during winter, short amounts of sunlight. Altitude has the same effect as increasing latitude, so it's just like going up. So it gets colder, you tend to see less diversity. The rocks in the soil, how rich it is. And then the amount of disturbances you can have, because disturbances can impact how much diversity you have. If you frequently have fires or you frequently have flooding, that can impact kind of how long species can settle in, how much they tend to shift around, and how well the species can adapt to that. How adjusted the species are to dealing with these disturbances, if it's an everyday thing or if it's like, holy crap, something terrible just happened and a bunch of things get wiped out. Okay, this just shows you the map with biomes. I'm not going to sit here and say memorize them all. I don't really care. What I want you to realize, though, is there is typically this pattern where you can see, based upon latitude, that we tend to have these kind of streaks of a particular type of biome. But it's not perfectly accurate. You can see some of these kind of wrap around. They're not in a nice little neat strip, and that tends to be because of stuff like altitude changes. That can be because of stuff like wind currents, ocean currents. There's other stuff, so it's not just about latitude, but latitude is a pretty good determinant when we're looking at stuff as far as what you'll find there. It's not perfect, but overall it's pretty accurate. Now, discussing a couple climate things, seasons, I just want to make sure you guys realize seasons are not caused by how far away we are from the sun. It's not. It's caused by the tilt of the Earth, and because this tilt shifts kind of which parts get direct access to sunlight, the parts that are facing away or tilted away from the sun, those ultimately will experience winter because they're getting less light, and the light that they get is more angled. It's not as direct, it's indirect. And so because of that, you get less heat from it. Whereas if you're tilted towards the sun, you get a lot more sunlight and a lot more direct sunlight, so ultimately you will have summer. So just realize this, and this picture here just shows the actual sunlight shining on stuff. So this here would be summer. You can see the northern hemisphere bathed in a lot of light, whereas out down here at the bottom you can see that the northern hemisphere is not getting bathed in very much light, and so that would be winter. So just make sure you know that, because a lot of people still screw that up. And then global climate, I want you guys to realize that latitude, beyond just the amount of sunlight you get, the tropics getting it pretty much year-round. They're always going to get direct sunlight, whereas the northern parts, and especially the poles, they're much more sporadic, lots of it in summer, very little light in winter. I want you to realize that there's also things like wind currents that tend to be associated with your latitude. So about every 30 degrees of latitude, you tend to see these kind of convection cells. You see these swirling types of air. And as the air goes up, it tends to be wet because it cools off and rains, and when the air is falling, it tends to be dry. So this is why around 30 degrees latitude, we tend to see deserts, because you've got these pressure systems where the air is coming down, so it creates a high pressure system that's dry. And you can see here showing you like the Sahara that's in this high pressure system at 30 degrees latitude. Same thing down here in the bottom, you can see this drier area around southern Africa. So just be aware there is some patterning too beyond just the amount of sunlight based upon your latitude, and it's more to do with the amount of like wind. It's more to do with air circulation. And then over here, this shows the ocean currents. You can see that, I'm not going to make you memorize these, but I want you to realize that as they flow around, you can see the cold ones in blue, you can see the warm ones that are ultimately going to be in red, and so these ocean currents can impact weather. Like you'll see much of Europe is very far north, but there's a warm stream of ocean that comes through that actually keeps it much warmer than we would expect. If you look at an equivalent place that's over in North America, like much of Canada, you'll see it's much, much, much colder there because it has a cold current, not this warm current to help it out. And so these ocean currents can have a significant impact on the climate based upon if you have a warm current or a cold current that's around you. All right, lake stratification. I just want you guys to realize that lakes typically will start to get layers, and you should experience this. If you stick your hand in, you might feel that it's warm during the summer, but then as you get further down, it starts to get cold, and in some cases very cold. So you thought that it was going to be warm because you stuck your hand in, but then you get in and you're like, I'm freezing cold. And so this is normal stratification, where you have warm water on top and cold water below. The key thing, though, in lakes is you start to get a bunch of nutrients that settle at the bottom as things die and decay, and you have oxygen that can get to the surface. So we have lots of oxygen up top, lots of nutrients in the bottom. Well, there's something called turnover that occurs in the autumn and in the spring, because as the temperatures change, it changes the density, so it allows it to get this kind of convection cell, and it allows it to bring nutrients up and oxygen down. So this is important just to make for the lake's health, to make sure that we keep things kind of nicely mixed a couple times a year, so it doesn't get to be where there's just a lot of oxygen up top, a lot of nutrients below, but the organisms can't get everything that they need. And so this will occur in the fall as you get the water cooling at the top. It cools, gets more dense, and falls, and so that creates this convection cell. And you get this in the spring, where ultimately the water on top is colder, and the most dense that water is 4 degrees. And so this water on top is actually less dense, because as you start to get ice, it spreads out as these hydrogen bonds become rigid. And so the top part of here is actually less dense. And so as it warms up, and this is rare, but as it warms up, it actually becomes more dense, and so it allows it to sink. And so this creates another convection cell, in this case in the spring. So whenever you get spring and fall, you're going to get nice mixing, and that's very good for the plant life, the animal life that lives there. So, some last minute things just to go over some terms that you may see. Microclimates, these aren't the big scale things. This isn't like the total amount of precipitation or the total temperature. This is going to be like a log that insulates things that live inside of it. You know, this is going to be like something living in the shade of a plant. Latitude, once again we've talked about this, that 30 degrees, or in many cases 260 degrees, etc., but 30 degrees, our predominant one, will be dry, because every 30 degrees you get this high pressure zone, so 30, 60, etc., and that tends to lead to less precipitation. It's most obvious at 30 degrees because you still have light. At 60 degrees, you're approaching the polar caps. I mean, that's like Arctic Circle, so we're not normally as worried about precipitation at that point, because it's usually so cold that you have some limitations on life anyway. Which side of a house in Ohio is warmest? You should realize it's due to the angle of the sun. So the sun is always going to be coming from the southern side, and so this is why you'll see a lot of things we'll talk about south facing to catch as much sunlight as possible, because the tilt of the earth. You know, the sunlight is not coming directly at us, it's coming at an angle, because whenever you're not at the equator, and to some degree the tropics based upon the tilt. So that one is going to be the south. And then we've got the last one here, why do mountains matter to wind? I just want you to realize that if we have a mountain and we've got wind coming that has to climb, whenever air is climbing, it tends to cause precipitation. So you're going to get rain on the side as it climbs, and then on the way down, it's going to warm. And as it warms, it's actually going to extract water typically. And so it's going to start to get warm where it wants to cause evaporation, so it can actually cause these very dry conditions. So this is why you'll have where the wind is coming in, you tend to have a lot of moisture. But then on the other side, you oftentimes have a desert. They call this orographic precipitation, but just be aware if you have mountains somewhere, it will affect the climate. You won't just worry about latitude. You can have where on the other side of the mountain, it's low, but it's very, very dry when you wouldn't normally expect that. It's not at 30 degrees latitude or something. So mountains will be another major impact on climate. That's it, guys. I hope that helps as you guys go through into your holiday work. Take it easy.